for an engineer, though they are informed by theory and they use theory as a way to get things done, the emphasis is much more on one of practicality. So he points out that on the first half, which is when he covers a lot more of theory, he notices that most of those theorists are clinical theorists. In other words, they're not interested necessarily in proving that this theory is beyond a shadow of a doubt 100% true. What they're interested is they're trying to create a theory that's functionally true, that works, that helps them as clinicians understand their patients and helps them use it to better help their patients. Sorry. So there's a big difference there too in how you even define this, and he kind of gets to the root of psychology from the beginning. And this is especially for the postmodernists. There's some postmodernists that have really critiqued this part of psychology because, in fact, psychology to some extent is a way of social engineering, right? What is a mental illness and what isn't? Well, the only thing that defines a mental illness versus one that isn't is whatever we choose to, as a society, define it as, right? So there is that strangeness of how psychology works, and it's indicative even of the medical field, right? Of what does healthy actually mean? Does healthy mean you're happier? Does healthy mean you just feel better? Does that healthy mean you'll live longer? Does healthy mean you're an embodiment of an ideal? And what Peterson's eventually going to make a case for is that all these calls to some extent are moral judgments, right? They're calls to what should be. And that's kind of where he makes this case that for his students, we should see ourselves all as engineers of the human spirit, both of your own and of others. And what he's going to point out is that first and foremost, obviously, you shape yourself. Your actions shape who you are, who you become, and how you view the world. Everything that you do then later informs you to make the you in the later time. But at the same time that you're doing that, you also are constantly influencing and creating others by the information that you give them. So the feedback and information that you provide to everyone else that you interact with is a direct line to how they're going to create themselves and how they see reality as well. So he kind of takes this weird approach that we should see ourselves as genuine engineers of the human spirit, of yourself and everyone else you interact with.
And this is really in contrast to the way I think we think about mental health and sort of a functioning personality or an effective personality, because it's not, as he's saying, this sort of, if it's ideal based, then it can't be sort of judged by science, right? There's no way to kind of define what is or is not a proper, healthy mental health, because as Roger's saying, it's ingrained in all these other societal elements and what's going on in history at that given particular time. And so instead, let's focus on what's malleable about personality, and that's this engineer component. Is how are we structured? How are we interacting with others? And that's really how he's gonna dive in here. And there's structural elements to the brain physiology that he's going to lay as kind of a groundwork, and then also really the clinical and active doing as you implement your understanding of personality and others' personalities.
I got the sense that he's going to bring up a series of psychologists and try to find what they'll have somewhat different models of approaching the same thing, which is human personality, but there's many different ways of categorizing people, just like, there's Myers-Briggs all the way to Big Five and even zodiac signs, right? Like there's so many different models. So I think he's trying to find the commonality in each one of them, and that's what you have to work with as a framework to create yourself into somebody who I think can work with others. That you find situations of games that you want to take part in, and then you think, does my personality match this? Like, for example, if you're going to be working in childcare, you probably want to have more agreeableness and conscientiousness. And if you're super disagreeable, you probably don't want that job. you'd probably be more suited to be a lawyer or whatever, right? So finding those patterns in yourself, applying it to the correct games, and I guess adapting with the whole thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Peterson calls it like an applied wisdom, right? So the active part of being this engineer is that you're understanding yourself and then you're negotiating with the world, right? When people give you what you want, you reward them with smiles. When they don't, you punish them with just turning away your attention. And so, yeah, as you're saying, there's these sort of games that will help us interact. And the first one he's going to lay out, as you said, is the Big Five personality model. Which is really, it's based in a statistical model. And you want to just dive into it, Roger? Anything else on?
Yeah, so before we jump in, I did want to point out something that is kind of important from Peterson's perspective. I've brought it up before in other talks, but for anyone who wasn't there, it's the idea that personality is actually the implicit structure that governs your perceptions and tilts you as to how you see the world. So the idea for Peterson's ideas, it's what you want or what you're seeking shapes what part of reality is even visible to you, what part of reality you can even see. So therefore, depending on your personality, that helps you, that is what determines what you value, which then determines what reality you even see, what's even highlighted around you. So it's going to be very important. And as Claire was kind of talking about, Peterson and most psychologists nowadays jump onto the Big Five trait personality model. And the main reason is because unlike many other models, a lot of models in personality tend to be shaped first by theory and then are mapped out. So in other words, you come up first with the theory. For example, for example, Jung would be an example of, he talks to a lot of clients and he kind of notices a big distinction between his clients, between the people that seek information outside of themselves and the people that seek information within themselves. And he kind of notices this separation, that they're always one or the other. And he creates this idea, this concept of introversion versus extroversion. And then later on, there's a test that's developed to be like, okay, well, we already have this theory of personality. How do these people fit in? And that's how a lot of personalities are in general shaped. The Big Five model is different in that they didn't do that. It was statistically based. What they essentially did was said, all right, let's get as many adjectives as we can to describe people, like just a big pool of adjectives. Now, let's see if they clump together. So they send a bunch of questionnaires to see, describing yourself, describing other people. Let's see if certain words start to clunk together. And what they notice is they start to clunk together into 5 different dimensions with 2 pools each. So what that means is there seems to be 5 different dimensions that we weigh people, and adjectives seem to correlate on this general spectrum that breaks down into the following. The first is openness. The easiest summary to this is essentially openness to ideas or concepts. If you're high in openness, it's normally related to creativity as well as a slight boost in intelligence. You're likely to be more liberal, and you're also likely to be more accepting. Another indicator is you're more likely to support open borders, open categories. Things like gender categories or categories in general like that are a lot more flexible for you, mostly because of that openness of concepts. If you're low in openness, you'll actually prefer structure. You'll prefer things to be in a certain order, but the idea is here more like a place for everything and everything in its place, right? So that, and I think this for Peterson's highlights one of the main reasons that you have such a clash with even the pronoun things or anything like that is because for one group, the borders can be blurred or even broken, and for the other group, there's direct borders on concepts and ideas that shouldn't be changed. If you're low in openness, you're also wary of new novel ideas, and you prefer what works now versus what might work better in the future. So you're more like, no, let's keep the thing that we know works, as opposed to trying to risk improving something that might actually just break everything else. And naturally, because of those 2 traits, they also tend to lean more conservative, right? It's a decent indicator of that. Again, these are a spectrum. These aren't a dichotomy. So you're not one or the other. It's from 100th percentile to 0th percentile.
Should also note that the openness is associated with the creativity. It's the creativity trait. So those in openness would tend more toward fiction and art and poetry and anything sort of aesthetic quality.
And the second dimension that they find that adjectives split into is conscientiousness. This normally is an indicator of, it's a good indicator of success and in school and work, as long as it's structured. So like Claire mentioned, if it's a creative endeavor, then you're likely openness is going to be more helpful there. You're diligent, industrial, you tend to like order because it allows you to get things done more. They sometimes correlate, but you could be extreme opposites. And it's another good aspect of marking your political goals. So between openness and conscientiousness, those are the two main things that indicate what your political beliefs might be. They're good at making good use of their time. And in general, Peterson's described it as, it's not so much that they want to climb the social hierarchy, but they actually feel negative emotion if they don't feel like they're doing something to climb the social hierarchy. These are the busybodies. These are the people that you normally see that cannot just sit there and do nothing. If you struggle to be laid back and lazy, if you struggle to just chill all day and not do anything, you're likely high in conscientiousness. Now, if you're low in conscientiousness, you're much more laid back. You tend to only do things when you first have determined if they're worth doing. A lot of times you'll find ways to be more efficient or to do only the things that need to get done. And you tend to not be very judgmental, whereas opposed to high conscientious people, you are judgmental, but it's because you care about getting things done. Whereas the lower conscientious person is much more selective in what it is they're going to put energy in. Did you have anything?
Yeah, no, I just want to clarify, because I've seen in the comments that each of these 5 pieces of the big 5 personality, they have a dichotomy within each of them. So they don't oppose each other, but within each of them, so within openness, there's high and low, and conscientious is high and low. And so it does seem that, yes, of course, there's a correlation if you trend in one the other, but they are sort of unique to each other. Conscientiousness is everything associated with like being a good student, being orderly, being industrious. In this, he's speaking to his class. And so this is the time he's going to also pull in his whole thing of like, do your homework early and write all your stuff. I mean, everything that is associated with kind of that orderliness and planning the future, right? So setting aim and then setting orderly goals in order to get there. That's all kind of conscientious traits.
And then the third dimension is extroversion. So with extroversion, this actually is also a sign that Jung was onto something, because he caught on to that exact same thing. With high extroversion, it's also an association of happiness or positive feelings, but it's also, in a way, how you actually see the world. So you tend to see the world as a place of full social opportunities. You're likely someone who gets very excited when you get to meet new people. If you're high in extroversion, likely this pandemic has been complete hell for you because you haven't been able to see anyone else. You normally have a large social network, and you normally see social structures as the source of support and source of kind of backup. You see that as the place where you've put all your eggs at. And oh, go ahead.
Yeah, Peterson refers to sort of these social niches especially within extroversion, but you can see in each of these, you have your niche. And so within extroversion, your social niche would be you see others as a place of opportunity, versus introversion, you're seeing it as somewhere to retreat from. And then he lays out just a really interesting historical view of this, which is that throughout time, the environment matches up with different social niches. So he's saying if you live in a tyrannical society, having a lot of extroversion, being kind of loudmouths, isn't going to serve you as well. And I think that that goes for really across all the 5 traits. And so therefore, you know, there's some amount of I dare use the word happiness, but meaning wrapped up in matching your temperament and that like ingrained niche to the demands that are going on in an environment. And I think extroversion is a way to really clearly see that, because we feel so uncomfortable when we're thrown into the opposite realm.
Right, because the opposite of high extroversion, which would be low extroversion, means you actually tend to not like social settings. You tend to actually avoid them. They tend to be, the classic way to measure it is if you get exhausted by them, if they cost you energy to engage in a social setting, as rather where extroverts seem to engage in getting energy from that. Another good way of conceptualizing this is, whose opinion do you care more of? Someone else's, or what your own opinion is of you? And both have their benefits, right? Like if you're okay with you, you really understand yourself, you understand what you want, you understand what you're seeking, but no one else likes you. If you care more about everyone else likes you, you have a support system, they all care about you, you're very interconnected to everyone else's lives, but you yourself may not know yourself as well as you would like, which also correlates with the next one, which is agreeableness. And with agreeableness, highly agreeable people tend to be extremely self-sacrificing. They do not like conflict. As you'll see in Maps of Meaning, this will come later, but women tend to be slightly more tilted to be slightly more agreeable. And Peterson thinks that that might be just an evolutionary cause for motherhood, for being able to not want to purposely want to avoid conflict, especially when child rearing and having children around, because violence, he says, violence and children in general don't mix well, right? It's not anywhere there's violence, that's not where you want to have a kid at. They tend to take care of others. They tend to place the needs of others in front of their own. The games that they play tend to be non-competitive and instead are very cooperative. On the other side, very disagreeable people, or people that are low in agreeableness, they do not do things that they don't want to do. They do not necessarily consider the social context as much when they're pursuing goals. They're very strong-willed. They're very stubborn. They're very assertive, but also they're very confident, mostly because they're not worried about offending anyone else. They're gonna go after their own goal. And again, you can see why both sides have a very a natural value depending on the context, right? That's in some situations, it's actually going to be way better for you to be agreeable, and others can be way better for you to be a disagreeable person. And that's kind of Peterson's general point, is that all of these exist because they all have a use. They wouldn't exist otherwise, right? They all have a practical use that has allowed it to survive through evolution. And finally, the last dimension is neuroticism. So if you're high in neuroticism, it tends to mean that you feel not just negative emotions, but that you feel, especially negative emotions, stronger. You actually have a more visceral response to emotion than someone who might be lower. You tend to be more convinced by feelings and emotions, or contexts that aren't necessarily rational or logical, but rather appeal to your humanity, appeal to empathy, appeal to more of those feelings. Whereas if you're low in neuroticism, it's almost like you don't have as much of a sensitivity to those emotions. You tend to be more emotionally stable, but it's also because of that, in some ways, more numb to the emotional to emotional stimuli. You tend to be moved more by logic than by emotion, but you also don't experience emotions at the same level. In other words, when someone's super excited, you don't get nearly as excited. When someone's super sad, you don't get nearly as sad. You're more leveled out, but it's like your system of priority is more on the logical end. And those are the 5 general dimensions. There's going to be a lot of correlations, a lot of situations where you may have two, as some people in the comments have been saying, you may have 2 traits that actually contradict each other. For example, one that's very common, especially among women, is high conscientiousness and high agreeableness. Now, that means that you are someone who's a hard worker and wants to get results and loves getting things done on time when they should be and keeping your word. But also, you kind of understand and like to be nice to people. And a lot of times what you'll see there is someone who's working their butt off, but also never willing to stand up and say, hey, you're not pulling your weight, or hey, you guys aren't paying me nearly as much. And that because of that, that tends to lead to a lot of clash, both within the person themselves and within how they actually express that, because they have two different drives that can be contradictory.
Yep, I think you've summarized them beautifully. Neuroticism, I think important to note that the term, I think that's one where the term is harder for people than the rest of them. It's not just neurotic, like that doesn't define really as we think about that term. And these are, all five of these are malleable, right? So while we do have a kind of natural temperament, these are things where we can change on the scale as we go through life experiences and as we're impacted by others, and as those other people shape us. And so Peterson says that it's not really obvious that our personality on these five traits is all inside us and all just has to do with us. The example he uses is a child more you than your arm is? Well, probably not, because you would easily cut off your arm for your child's life. And so we are made up not just of this kind of static personality, but of a lot of different subcomponents that make up a person. And we're nestled in this kind of complex system. And so it's that's where this engineering component comes into it, because as we understand ourselves and what we like and dislike about ourselves and our natural tendencies, we can change the engineering and change the rigging. Similarly, as we interact with others and want to get what we want out of them in a moral, in the highest moral way, we understanding those traits is helpful.
So I was thinking about neuroticism, because this is a term I have not understood for such a long time, but it kind of sounds to me like it's the measure of how reactive you are to your life circumstances. So correct me if I'm wrong, it kind of sounds like if you're high in it, then things just tend to trigger you more, or you just tend to feel emotions more strongly. But if you're lower in it, then you're a little more numb to it. There's more of a wall between you and it.
Yeah, so the best way that I've understood it is actually the relationship between me and my partner. And what I noticed is she has higher neuroticism. She's higher in the neuroticism trait than I am. And what I noticed is a lot of things that for me are slightly sad or kind of just like, okay. Like for her, they impact her really hard. But what's very important to understand is that neither of these, there's no value system here. Like one is not better than the other, because at the same time, yeah, she may react harsher to negative emotions, but she also reacts way more intense to any positive emotions too, right? So there's more dysregulation, but in that dysregulation, there's a higher payoff and a higher punishment. So like when she's having a blast, or like when she's excited about things, I'm very envious. And I'm very envious because it's like, well, you could, like that could be like, that looks amazing. That looks super fun. But then there's plenty of other times when it's a negative emotion that you can truly see it impacts her way more than it impacts me, even though we're both processing the same information.
Mm-hmm.
So
your high emotion, like your emotions can only really go like that, but hers will go up.
Right. So it's more of like, I conceptualize it as the impact that emotions have on you, like the degree of how much the dial's turned up, right?
Right. Yeah.
So,
That's what I was trying to articulate earlier. Yeah, but that's kind of what I was getting at.
And while it is absolutely true that there is no value system associated with being high and low in any of these, it is true that certain environments will benefit someone in a certain time that is one or the other. And so, and that's where societal structural components throw off what good mental health is, because what's good might be some spike in neuroticism in a given time or place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of like it's sort of like what I was trying to say earlier. Like, if you finding a situation, a game, and acclimating yourself to one that you fit into. It's like you're a puzzle piece, and the situation around you is the rest of the puzzle. And which one do you fit into best?
Exactly. Yeah.
No, yeah, I was gonna say that's exactly what gets highlighted. Go ahead, Claire. Do you have any other points?
No, yeah, Peterson says successful adaptation requires this. So, that's where we get evolution and potentially maybe, I don't know, but you could adapt a series of people toward a certain trait in a given environment at scale. I have no idea. I'm going to stop.
So one thing I want to do, Roger, fantastic summary of Big Five. Would like to ask everybody if they're familiar with Big Five personality, or there is a tool that Zoom has now. So if you open up, click on the participants, and you'll see the participants window. There are two buttons, yes or no. So if you're familiar with Big Five, just type yes. Otherwise, type click on no. If you can't figure the tool out, you can type in the chat. All right, so we got, okay. I'm going to give another about 10 seconds for people to vote if they want. You can say yes or no in the participant window by clicking on yes or no, or you can type yes or no in the chat. Padma, we are not doing questions right now. We are simply trying to say yes or no. So, all right, so that's good. So out of 29, about 17 say yes. And Tanya answers yes, no, maybe. So, all right, so with that, I just wanted to get a quick idea, and we will go ahead. We'll go ahead with the presentation. What we'll do is that, yes, Roger, I think it's a great idea for us to ask people to take the test, but let's do that closer to when we are actually dealing with the topic. So it'll be fresh on people's mind, and then we'll dive into it in great amount of detail. All right, folks. So that's what we will do. So whenever we are covering this topic in great amount in detail, we will put out the put a test in the meetup, and we encourage you to take the test. Even if you have taken it before, you can go ahead and take it again, because that really gets your mind going on this topic. And we're going to dive into this. He has, I think, 4 or 5 meetups. Not 4 or 5 meetups. I always think in terms of meetups. Videos. Jordan Peterson does videos, not meetups. On this. So this is a very large topic, and we look forward to going to that. Okay, back to you, Roger and Claire.
Perfect. And so Peterson also starts to bring in here a little bit more of the mythological perspective. And this is kind of similar to what we've talked about with Piaget. It's the idea of our processes of learning and developing also being embodied within our myths, and those myths being representations of actual personalities. So he kind of gives this general idea, and he says that there's this story that's been told a million times about this eternal dragon that lives underground. Every now and then it comes up and threatens the state, and someone always defeats it and then returns with a boon of great value, something that has a great value. And essentially what Peterson points out here is that we always learn by confronting what frightens or disgusts us. And he brings up Jung quote that I really like, that he says it in Latin, and I'm not going to try to say that, but the translation is, "In filth it will be found." And it's the idea that in going to confront what it is that scares you or disgusts you, the reason you have that sensation, that fear, is because you in a part don't understand the thing that you're scared of or disgusted by. And therefore seeking out that knowledge and confronting that voluntarily allows you to map it better. And this is kind of how we actually learn about the world. So then Peterson says, it's like, well, what is it that we need to actually learn about the world? And the case he makes is, well, what is it that you learn when you do something, when you do anything? Well, if what you want to happen happens, you've learned two things. One, you learn that you can get what you want, but two, more importantly, you learn that you understand the world correctly, right? Because if you didn't understand the world correctly, you wouldn't be able to do what you thought of to actually occur in the world. So the fact that what you thought was going to happen actually happened means, hey, my theory of the world is correct. But Peterson points out, it's like what's actually more likely to what's actually happens a lot also, but is much more complex, is what happens when what you wanted to happen didn't happen. When you try something and it doesn't work at all, you get a completely different reaction. Well, not only do you not get what you want, but it also means that the world, the way you're thinking of the world is wrong. More importantly, it's wrong in a way that you don't understand. Because all you know that it's wrong. All you know is I'm wrong. You don't know where, how, or what part of my theory is wrong. And the idea is that to address this, you have to go down and explore where the error was. And that requires you to go and face things you probably haven't faced in a long time. Go and face things that you haven't seen in a while. It's not pleasant, and you normally don't always have the iron. You go in and you don't have the answer, but you are required to have one because you have to, in order to move forward. And Peterson believes that this is essentially the abstraction of that story of the dragon, right? Every now and then, a dragon, a giant monster of God knows what size or proportion, comes out. And you have to face that and figure it out. And once you figure out where you were wrong, you bring that information back, and it makes the world a better place. And so Peterson says, here's a general meta-narrative, a way of conceptualizing reality in our existence that allows you to kind of hang the idea of personality. And he says, there are two things we need to know in existence. One, what the world is, right? That's kind of science's role. How do we use the things around us? How do we make the world better? And then the second thing that we need before we can even really do that is, how is it we're supposed to act? How do I even stay alive? What do I do? And for Peterson, he kind of points out that to have any form of action, you need to be able to prioritize the things around you. You need to conceptualize and be able to prioritize. And you need these things as a fundamental part of existence for survival, for mating. So this is kind of where Peterson asks us, is like, try to conceptualize the world as a place to act rather than a place of things first. Because if you do that, you see that the world isn't just made up of random objects that all have equal value. You're living in a place where the value is apparent to you, right? And every single thing you can look at has some form of value. And what Peterson's case is that your personality is what determines what things stick out to you, what you can actually see, what you actually pay attention to, what you actually notice. Like you're looking at me through a screen right now, but in your peripheral view, there's probably a bunch of different other objects, all of which you could be focusing on, but you're not. Why? Because there's been something inside you that's already decided that what I'm saying is likely more important than, a random book on your shelf, right? But that requires a priority already. That requires a hierarchy of value that's already pre-established. If you're someone who hates philosophy and hates psychology, you likely wouldn't be listening to me. You'd likely be doing just about anything. You'd be looking at your pen. You'd be more interested in anything else. And it's this idea that temperament shapes what actually seems important to you and what you actually see as interesting. And that's kind of where Peterson's going to take this to. And he's going to point it to, this is a schema of morality. And essentially it starts from evolution. Evolution gives rise to certain Darwinian processes. These would be the Jungian archetypes. And then he's also going to show how from this meta-narrative, you can actually hang a lot of different personality theories. So that's kind of the general goal for this class that Peterson's laying out. Did you guys have any different perspectives or takes on that?
I'm thinking about the term dragon and also the gold that it is protecting. Because on one hand, one thing I think it's always conceptualizes this killer dragon that you have to slay. But I think that it might be a better approach sometimes to look at the dragon as something to befriend, because you're not just trying, because that dragon might be a core part of your personality that you don't want to look at, but once you do, it scares you. But then you don't want to kill that. You want to just integrate it. It's like when you look at your shadow and then it integrates into your being, right? And now you're more powerful because you've unlocked that area of your personality. So sometimes I think it could be beneficial to conceptualize it as a friendly, potentially friendly dragon. Like you're gonna like make it your pet.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And the example Peterson uses in the video is of like going to a social function and having sort of a joke prepared, or just thinking that something is going to go down in that social interaction, and then the joke kind of falls flat. And it's such a simple, silly thing that shouldn't ruin your life. You know, we all say things that fall, but we've all been in that experience where you're like, okay, what just happened there? First of all, I'm not funny, which means I have a fundamental different understanding of myself than who I really am, like huge identity crisis. Second of all, my friends aren't who I thought they were. Their humor is different than that. My friends don't like me, and therefore I've been being deceived this whole time. I don't even know what's funny and what's not. And so suddenly the value system, as Roger's saying, that we have to understand our life is completely flawed, and everything kind of falls apart. And so fixing that isn't about sort of like killing something and slaying something, but it's like looking at the things that really make you uncomfortable, and probably the ones that make you the more uncomfortable are the ones to look at more deeply, and figure out what your schema is, and then redo, you know, get into the belly of the whale and get through all the guts and sort it out and find the parts that work and rebuild the map.
Yeah, it's like if you're an archer and you're trying to hit that bullseye, but then you hit it not even on the target board at all. And you just kind of recalibrate your aim, your muscles, adjust for wind and whatever, until you just get to that center. But looking for the adjustments can be painful, and missing can be embarrassing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but at the same time, the only way you get better is that you have to confront that. You have to confront that pain, right? Like it's that embarrassment and that failure that's a requirement for you to get good enough to be able to hit that target, right?
Yeah, it's like he says this one thing in another lecture. He said you have to be something like, if you want to be a master, you have to be willing to be a fool first.
Yeah,
it's like make a lot of mistakes, then eventually you'll be perceived as a master. But at the beginning, prepare to be embarrassed a few times.
Yeah, it's also the Jung's point of the trickster prior to the savior, right? Like
a classic.
Yeah.
And so just to sort of tie this up, what Peterson is going to do now that he's kind of set up, you know, the way to think about personality as an active, you know, a way to act. It's a tool to use as an engineer of ourselves and of sort of our society. And so he's going to go forward sort of, you know, timing is important here. That first, he's kind of situating us in the deep history, right? What is the oldest kind of mythological stories that we can hold true? And then he's going to kind of pile on top of that these more archaic modes of sort of personality conceptualization. How do we conceptualize these different parts of ourselves and how we transform? And then moving on to sort of constructivism, which we already got a taste for with Piaget, and then moving into the classic depth psychologists of Freud and Jung, who kind of strung it on. So when you put all these together, it's really a comprehensive understanding of psychology, but he's going to do it in a way that helps you build a map and really understand it and live it and like make it active, rather than just like, here's all the psychologists and here's what their beliefs and here's their experiments. So, I mean, if you'll join us on this over the next 7 weeks or so, you know, these really become tools that I think we can walk away knowing ourselves a little bit better, and then having tools to kind of go about our weeks more effectively as we interact with others.
Mm-hmm. So we're aiming for a practical framework.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Shrikant, you want to go to questions?
Yes. What I want to do is I want to do something different because we're starting out this series. And I want to actually know where everybody else is and how everybody is looking at this, because I think that will get us started instead of just asking details about, the big five or about this. I want to know what people know and what their interests are, what they have found useful, so in terms of trying to understand personality, if you wanted to summarize, what you have learned, what are your sources, what are your interests, I'll give you 2 minutes. So each person has 2 minutes to talk about what their interest, what their knowledge and interest are. But I'm going to keep it voluntary at this point. And I urge you to volunteer, and you can volunteer by just typing an exclamation mark, because the more we know about where each of us is coming from, I think the more we will get from this series. So we're going to start with Mamta, followed by Sanjay. And folks, try to keep yourself brief. 2 minutes is the maximum. And so it's going to be Mamta, Sanjay, and Dave. Mamta, go ahead.
Okay, so I'm being vulnerable here on April 2019, I figured out that my mom is a covert narcissist. And
let's do one thing.
Yeah.
Mamta, sorry to interrupt you. What we're trying, I know you are new to these meetups, but what we're trying to do is that we are not going to go into any personal issues. We're simply going to talk about how we approach the concept of personality. What are some of the influences on you? What are you studying? Those kind of things. Okay.
So that impacted me, and that was the major challenge that I started digging further into personality types. And I didn't know that I have been an HSP or empath. So that's why I have been digging into deeper into it, because when people laugh, I tend to laugh more. When people cry, I tend to cry more. So this was very unique for me, but I didn't know that there are many people like me. So that's why this is of special interest to me, to understand the personality type. That's it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Mamta. That is beautiful. And I think, we're going to look at it in so many different ways. And I think all of us are going to walk away with many new insights. So thank you. Next up is going to be Sanjay, followed by Dave. Sanjay, go ahead. Sanjay, you have to unmute yourself. Okay, there is a problem. Okay, just a second. Let me just see what's going on. Okay, yes, sorry about that. I don't know what happened. Now try.
Okay, yes, that's better. Thank you.
Okay.
So I wanted to say briefly that psychology is not yet a hard science. Many areas are theoretical, and there are many theories that show a lot of promise, and they're understood and work in clinical practice. But there are, I'm sure some of the people here know this also, that many of the studies that have been done, they are not able to be replicated either by the same group or by other groups. And so the theories are broad, they overlap. Also, the issue of diagnosis of actual disorders is quite complex in terms of the techniques and the areas, and oftentimes they depend on the expertise and the specialization of the therapist, of the practitioner. And a person can, for example, go to one practitioner who does not have experience and give a diagnosis, which may not necessarily be correct. So it's a very difficult field to get concrete data in. So the main point I'm trying to make is that we have to be cautious, not about the ideas. I mean, the ideas are understood to some extent. They're not proven as they are in the hard sciences, but we have to be cautious that these are general categories and general explanations of things. We really don't understand personality that well today.
Excellent point. I also want to make it clear that this is an educational meetup. None of us are psychiatrists or psychologists, and we are not trying to, kind of, individuals are enormously complex, and we definitely recommend, so you use this opportunity to learn about things, and you have to apply it yourself. With that, it's going to be next is going to be Dave, followed by Mike, followed by Maritza and Joe. Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Shrikant. I've mentioned a few times about 25 years ago, I took several psychology courses, and I read a lot of the books by the psychologists, Carl Rogers on Becoming a Whole Person, Albert Ellis, Gestalt therapy, and they were very meaningful to me, but you may recall what drew me into 55 Living Ideas originally was diving into Carl Jung. But so I'm very interested in getting into looking at each one of these psychologists. And as Peterson was saying, they all have different approaches, but there are some commonalities. But to me, I think would be very well time spent. In the chat, we've had some arguments about, oh, this is useless and this is wrong and this is right. But I think there's something to be learned by everybody from everything, if this is your thing. But I'm very much looking forward to it. Thank you.
Excellent, Dave. Thank you. Next up is Mike. Mike, go ahead.
Hey there. So I'm very new to all this stuff, as in, like, this is the very first meetup in terms of this particular topic. So things that I want to think about, sort of going off of what Sanjay was saying about psychology not necessarily being a hard science. What I'm thinking of here is psychology as sort of a metaphor, or these 5 dimensions as sort of a metaphor for thinking about things, as opposed to being phenomenologically sort of relevant to anything at all. Insofar as the relationship between psychology and neurology are not necessarily, there's not necessarily a causal relationship there, and perhaps can't be a causal relationship there. And then the other thing that I was thinking about was one of the points that was made very early on in this conversation about personality being a definitional structure for what is even perceivable in the world. So sort of what I'm thinking about here is the basic foundational circular nature of what we're talking about here, insofar as the conversation, as we perceive the conversation, is itself based on the personality types that we're defining within the conversation, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So even what I'm saying now is going to be perceived through the lens of the putative personalities of all the rest of you, or something like that. I'm not really making a point. That's just sort of what's been on my mind. So.
Well, thank you very much. That's an excellent point. Both what is said and what is listened to is definitely, we bring our personalities to it. I also want to say something about Sanjay. I think Sanjay made a great point. Psychology is at a very early stage. We are kind of almost at a pre-alchemy stage in chemistry, and maybe even pre-Tycho Brahe stage in physics or astronomy. But at the same time, we have this brain and we have our life. We cannot say that, okay, I will wait till the science catches up in 300 years. We may not be there anymore. And so we have to live now. So I think the approach that I like about Jordan Peterson is that he has this engineering approach of saying, okay, we need to work with ourselves and based on whatever knowledge we have. So we are at this stage, cannot really even be engineers. We are more of artisans. And if you look at kind of the Industrial Revolution and the history of science, it is the tinkerers that kind of gets things started, and then you build concepts out of it. So there has to be a lot of, Buckminster Fuller has this, he calls himself a 50-year experiment. And so that's what we are doing. We are experimenting with ourselves because there is no other alternative that we have. We cannot say that there isn't enough knowledge, so I'm going to wait for it. We have to use the knowledge. We have to test it. And one of the things that these meetups do is that you can talk to other people about what you know, and they will talk to you about what they know, and that provides an additional corrective mechanism so that we don't get caught up in our biases or our pet theories, but we can, so that it provides kind of a additional feedback, robust, large feedback mechanism for development of our knowledge and building of our lives. So next up is going to be Marisa, Joe, and Aaron. Marisa, go ahead.
Hi, so I actually have almost zero classes taken in psychology. I think I had a psychology class in high school, but all of my my college training was all in mathematics, as it were. But I find it a really fascinating topic, and I was interested like more heavily in Jung, and so I do a lot of reading of psychological works and philosophers just on my own for my own enjoyment. And so I was interested in Myers-Briggs from the Jungian perspective, but then I had a job that asked us to take the Big Five model several years back now, and that's how I got introduced to the Big Five. And I went looking it up, and I was interested, and I looked up the Enneagram for Personality, a couple others of those, and I had, and this was years back. More recently, I came back to it to revisit because I was I had a girlfriend who always made jokes to me that she was like, "Oh my gosh, I swear you're on the scale, you're on the spectrum." She used to say to me, because sometimes my emotions may seem to be lacking, or my maybe I don't show the right, I don't have the right social response. And I took the test for to see if I was on the autistic spectrum, just for kicks and giggles and to shut her up. And the joke was on me because I actually tested super high into the very autistic. And I was like, all right, I obviously didn't read this correctly. So I went and took it again, purposefully trying to be less weird or less whatever, that whatever in my mind I thought would have made me seem more normal. And I scored even higher. And I was like, what's going on? I am obviously not, I would not consider myself autistic. Some people here today have met me in person, and I function fairly normally. So I've gone back and I've been looking at the different personality models again, just out of a curiosity for what, I'm interested in the slide and scale aspect. I feel like the Big Five model does a better job of showing that there's not black and white, that it's more, you have a little bit, and I really like the concept that you have a little bit of all of them within you. And to me, it helps me just feel a little better for my absolute failure in that test, thinking that my broad way of thinking might just be incompatible with the manner in which that test is structured. That could be crap, but that's what I like to tell myself to make myself feel better. But anyway, I'm interested in this. I'm actually really excited because this is a course, so it'll pull in some more of the philosophers. So I'm really interested in getting a fuller perspective to add upon the things that I've already learned on my own.
Excellent. The reason that we focused on this course in our New York meetups, and we spent almost close to like maybe 6 months going through it every Saturday, is because I like Jordan Peterson's approach to this topic. It is the approach of what he would call consilience. He doesn't just look at kind of traditional psychologist. He looks at biology. He looks at mythology. He looks at philosophy. So, and all these, he actually brings in a lot of history, kind of political history, for example. And he's trying to kind of paint a picture, which comes from looking at this entire richness and variety of human experience and human knowledge. And that's the approach that he brings. So, which is a much more stabler way of proceeding. And that's why this course is great. Next up is Joe. Joe, go ahead.
I mean, I'm interested. I have very little experience in the psychological sciences, but I've always been interested in how people make decisions. And I think this has what these courses provide are frameworks for asking questions, the right types of questions. And so while all these studies may not be repeatable, they at least give us a way of inquiring about why we perceive things the way we do. I also am very interested in how they inform our moral frameworks as well. You know, how these personalities map to certain types of ways of living and philosophies of life. I think that's a fascinating question as to how, you know, we choose and the best way to experience you know, each other. And you know, ultimately this is about logic and reasoning. And I think that to me is the most, you know, what is really knowledge at this point, right? What does it mean to truly understand something? And that is the most invigorating thing to me about this meetup. And I think that what we really did was last week, there was a very good job of blending, you know, analytical philosophy and moral philosophy and linguistics. And it was really, and even the idea that NAP's a meeting and the frameworks, you could start to see a lot of connections between a lot of different areas. And to me, that's the most interesting part about these meetups in general, let alone, you know, just this particular meetup. Although this particular meetup's a very big part of that. So no offense here, no offense. But to you know, when you start to see how they all link together, and I really find that to be something where, you know, I find that to be a very interesting exploration.
Thanks, Joe. Next up is Aaron, followed by John. Folks, we want to hear from you. So please let us know what you think about personality, what approach you take. Adrian, I also want to hear from you. You've been making lots of comments on the chat, so would love to hear what you have to say. So next up is Aaron.
Yeah, so one thing I want to say about psychologists is I think we should view psychologists the same way we view philosophers, because we tend to have this very broad stroke of like, well, the psychologists say, and I'm like, psychologists are at each other's throats all the time. There's a huge faction of psychologists that hate Freud, and they completely do not believe in like the Oedipus complex, and there's psychologists who love Freud. So I think that when we're talking about these figures, we should treat them in the same vein as philosophers. Like Plato is very different than that of Nietzsche, but there's stuff that we can learn from Plato and there's stuff that we can learn from Nietzsche. So if we don't paint this very broad stroke of like the psychologists say this, but like this psychologist says that and that one says that, then we can start extracting wisdom from each of these individuals and kind of negating things. Like we can take the wisdom of Freud, but if we don't really like the Oedipus complex, we can sort of leave that behind. So I think that's, if we start looking at these figures like philosophers, we're going to get a lot more out of this.
Thanks, Aaron. Great observation. Next up is John.
Yeah, so yeah, you know, I've gone through this course before, if I recall correctly, and enjoyed it greatly. And I think there's a few reasons I find this course valuable. One is it sort of gives a framework through which to learn more about myself and learn more about other people. I mean, I feel like some people are sort of naturally sort of people smart or like they sort of can sense personalities, and you know, I'm not one of those people, so I've had to do some work to do it, and this has helped me do some work and understand. Also, it's good to just have a number of the perspectives of like realizing where other people are coming from, you know, just knowing the fact that other people, like with the personality traits, just knowing the fact that someone's going to react like gutturally differently than you is such a valuable thing to know. When somebody goes crazy for no reason, if you don't have that perspective, you're just going to think they're crazy, but maybe they're just coming from a different place. So I find that very useful as well. Another thing too is I think there's sort of like a value for going through this material again and again and discussing with people and syntopically looking at it. I think that's something that sort of Aaron was touching on. I find it more valuable because it's so rich, you know. It's like that how to read a book thing. You know, some books you want to read again and again and again. I feel like this is one of those areas. And finally, I just really like the way Peterson sort of explains things and breaks them down, because he sort of goes for this first principles approach, where during his lectures, he's like, okay, this is what psychology is. And he sort of, you know, people, we often sort of assume these labels, but he'll say, no, it's actually a mental framework through which to learn more about yourself so you can go through the world more effectively and interact better with others. And I just love the, you know, even if his particular interpretations aren't like, you know, necessarily that one isn't your cup of tea, I find that so useful, that practice of decomposing these more complex ideas into simpler ideas and explaining them. And he does that a lot. And so also the great people here that are, you know, doing this meetup. So I'm looking forward to it.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much, John. John and Claire were some of the, you know, main, you know, some of the regular participants, you know, when we went through this at the New York meetups. Next up is going to be Brian, followed by Claire. But I invite everybody to share. So Brian, go ahead. I
am not a psychologist, don't have a great deal of professional knowledge in that area. I was for about 20 years a manager in an international company, and we had a lot of development courses which included various psychological aspects. Of course, I've done a lot of general reading in that area as well, and for about 5 years I ran a coaching consultancy, which not professional psychologists, but we include quite a lot of amateur psychology in there. One interesting thing, I worked on a project with about a group of 10 professional psychologists on a cabin crew project that we were looking at. And of those 10 people, when I met at one meeting, I raised young, and while they weren't looking at that, they all fell about laughing, but they loved Freud, absolutely loved him. Very strange. But anyway, that's it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Brian. Next up is Claire, Joel, and Jean. Claire, go ahead.
Yeah, my favorite part about these tools, I think, is that they become, Mike called them a lens, or they become filters. And so really, whether you think they're right or wrong, it doesn't remove the ability to apply the filter to what you're looking at. And so, I mean, if you take agreeableness, like we all, if we were to cast that on ourselves, could potentially learn something about ourselves by interacting with that trait. And you know, what I think is really compelling, and Carl Rogers says that communication between people and honest communication is what can make our personalities actually change. And I'm really interested in personality transformation, not, you know, in a way to fix yourself, but just to watch how those things can change. 2 traits that I've really pushed on is increasing my conscientiousness. I'm just kind of a laissez-faire kind of gal, and I think I've been effective in that. And the other is kind of decreasing my levels of agreeableness. That's one that's way harder. I think I've accomplished a lot, but I've only moved like a very small amount. But you know, that's not because I want to correct something, but I think watching this lens and watching how you can like work on it with people and talk it through is really effective, and we can become what we want to be.
Excellent. Thank you, Claire. Next up is Joel, followed by Jean.
Thank you very much, Shrikant, and all the panelists, especially Roger, who I think has a radio announcer's voice. Sometimes I turn everything off and just listen to his voice. If you don't have a career in that field, you might want to investigate that. I have a significant background, but it's very ancient in Myers-Briggs. I was accredited by Otto Kroger and Associates. I'm not sure if they're still around. There was a time when you needed credentials just to be able to buy the Myers-Briggs indicator. And as you're aware, Shrikant, I developed my own model type chart, which was banned from the market because It may have supplanted the Myers-Briggs type chart.
Oh, okay.
So when the University of Toronto Press wanted to sell the posters, they said, if you sell his posters, you can stop selling our indicators and testing material. So it was an education for me, something totally unexpected. And I agree with you that it's more of an artisan type of thing. However, I would liken it to astronomy, where, you know, Uranus has 27 moons. And the first one was discovered in, I think, 1871 or 1873. And few of them were discovered up until 1948, when we thought there were 5 moons. And then the satellite went up and took pictures, and now we find there were 22 more moons up there. So I think that may be the state that psychology and testing and all that is in, and hopefully someday we'll get instruments to see things more clearly and more fully.
Thank you, Joel. Next up is going to be Jean.
Yeah, this is a great topic. I did the test earlier, and I also listened to this lecture, the link they sent. You know, I usually think it's pretty boring, you know, like Jordan Peterson in the classroom. But then I actually listened to it, it's fascinating. What I learned, I think it really helped us to understanding ourselves and others as well. One thing I learned is quite interesting about how the openness related to the political views. So the people with higher openness usually are Democrat, and the people are more, you know, older, like the older not change, they're usually Republican. So I saw the NPR interview one of the person, I was like, and I have found it's so ridiculous. Like, people, you cannot change anybody's will, even though it's obvious to you, other people see totally differently. So this debate, whatever, is totally waste of time. But anyway, I also learned, you know, like, I'm very high in low in agreeableness, so which is, they said women are high in agreeableness. Oh, I said that's interesting. But so I think there's as I mentioned, you know, like I think this is a great way to, and also high in emotion. What do you call the neurotic or whatever? So it's basically the mood change very strong, which is woman's character. So I think people are so different, you know, it's very helped me to understand myself and also the people around us. I think this is very valuable. I really like you guys' work. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jean. Next up is Roger.
So yeah, I just wanted to comment because I've been reading these comments and they've been really fun and engaging. One of the main things that should be noted though is the difference between what the goal is as a science and what the goal is as engineering. So as a science, as I mentioned at the start, that's when you're attempting to prove something through evidence, right? And that would be your more behaviorist. And Peterson himself will say, it's like, you know, I don't mock behaviorists. It's like, they're the ones that are giving you the most true thing we know. However, kind of bringing it back to Jung's critique of psychology as a science is this idea of, in science, like I only have a bachelor's in psychology, but one of the things that they always trained us in was there's always a black box. So you can explain a lot of things, but there's one black box in psychology that you do not open, and it's consciousness, right? The minute you hit consciousness, you got nothing to say about it because it can't be touched by science. It's an actual literal limitation. You can't, and just philosophically speaking, you can't even know if that's what you're actually interacting with or if you're interacting with the actual systems that create consciousness or even how consciousness functions. It's a constantly eluding thing. And Jung kind of makes the point that's like, look, maybe we can't hit it through science, but we can see what goes in. We can also see what comes out. And that can give us some reflection of possible structures within the consciousness itself, within those parts. So again, Jung himself, and the reason I'm bringing up Jung is because Peterson sees himself as a Jungian, wouldn't say that certain parts of his theory are scientific. What he would say is they're practical. He's trying his best to map out the internal structures, and so is Peterson. And in using those is to better understand humans' as humans, not necessarily as an empirically proven theory, but rather as a theory of why do we believe in God? Where do we come? Where did our morals come from? Where did all these structures develop? Why did it develop? How did it develop? And, you know, using that his consilience approach, he's going to take in evolution, biology, psychology, myths, religion, and see how they all interconnect to make his case better, that this is the framework that could possibly be functioning with all of them. So seeing this as not valid because of its science is asking the wrong question from the start. So just wanted to clarify that.
All right. Anybody else wants to share? Adrian, would you like to share what you've been writing? Okay. All right. Okay. So let me talk about my take on this. See, the way I approach it is that I found that we are enormously complex, and what goes on between people is even more complex. What happens in a group is even more complex. So the complexity is just mind-boggling, and we really don't have tools to deal with it well. That's the situation. So the question is, what do we do in such a situation? We still need to live. We have to act, and we have to make the most of our lives. We have to understand ourselves as best as we can. We have to understand the people that we are dealing with as best we can, and do it. So how do we proceed? So when I discovered this personality, so I'll just tell you this story. So when I discovered this personality stuff, first thing I discovered was Carl Jung and his psychological functions. I was completely blown away by it. I actually prefer Carl Jung's approach to it because it is more dynamic and it is more useful to me of thinking about how things change, how the interactions work, instead of just saying, okay, where does this person fit in? Instead of just pigeonholing a person, I'm able to use it in terms of how does the dynamic actually work. So I was very excited about that. And so what I did was that I did an experiment. See, I've been running these meetups in New York, and I'm able to get between like maybe 30 to 80 people reliably. So what I did is that, okay, let's try this out. So I did meetups. I did almost 20 meetups on these psychological functions. And they were enormously popular. I would get on an average about 70 to 80 people to show up. And then I would divide them into groups by different functions and different combinations. So I would have 4 different experiments for each meetup. So different groups based on different functions or opposite functions, or somebody being extroverted versus an introverted, each person. And then there would be kind of questions where people could actually make observations. And I found that to be extremely useful because you need a lot of data of actually trying to figure out how this thing is working. And and you have to try to induce from it patterns as best as you can, correct things, whatever theories you're subscribing to, you have to check them against your own experience. You have to get good at using these things in your life in terms of, okay, if a person is approaching, is kind of more kind of feeling oriented, or is more intuitive, or is more kind of concrete oriented, how do you explain something? How do you relate to them better? What is it that you're strong at? What is it that you are weak at? And how do you make the most of it? So all of this, and you do that by talking to people who are like you, people who are unlike you. And that is what the great opportunity is. So we are all very different from each other. At the same time, we are very similar in some ways. To be able to talk about all of these things, I think significantly accelerates our own learning curve. So that's what I love about this. And I think this kind of medium of meeting and talking to a large number of people about this in a structured way is a good way of doing that. I also want to plug one thing. My best take on all of this, I'm doing a series of meetups on that. The next meetup of that is going to be this Monday. And that's going to be basically, I have kind of 4 functions theory. I think for me, the functions as best as I have them right now are kind of planning, or from the bottom, it is kind of acting. So you're acting, then you're intuiting. You have some kind of a intuitive subverbal way of having a vision about what you're doing. Then you have an ability of testing, deliberating and testing. And then you have an ability of planning things in space and time to make things happen. So those 4 functions, I think, captures everything that I see. And what I will be talking about this time will be the dynamics of it. How are different people kind of stronger and weaker in all these 4 functions? And how do they cycle through these functions? How do you go from intuition to testing? When do you need to go from planning to testing? When do you find that you really need to go to action in order to move forward? And how do you find out what is missing? So the dynamics of it, and how do you think about the dynamics of it? That's what I'm going to do. It's enormously complex topic. I tried to deal it last time. I did I think a decent job, I thought, but the questions that I got were so incredible that I had to reformulate everything and to put it in a much more kind of a flexible way. And that's what I'm going to do on Monday. So I'm very, very eager about this, and I really love this course, and look forward to going through it and getting more and more richer things. Now, let me see if anybody else has. Okay, so Stefan, you're next.
Yeah, I'm trying to come up with, a takeaway that summarizes all of this. Because we were talking about, it sounds like psychology is one of those things that's just fairly subjective. Like one person was saying there was a group that was really into Freud, but not Jung, which is kind of contradictory, most would think. And there's other people who borrow from this school of thought and that school and whatever, right? And we're all trying to figure out the personality type or the framework that aligns with all of them. But maybe that just comes down to which situation you're in and which game you're playing at the moment. So like right now, there's an aspect of all of our personalities that have aligned because we're here for the same interest. Like we're not going to be completely like this, but there's something like this going on. I'm not sure, but I'm thinking that might be the closest definition you ever get.
Yeah, that's excellent. I think, one of the things that I found is that working with multiple models, but this is kind of the Bayesian approach to things. So you have models and you're always testing, models have to predict what is going to happen. And you have these multiple models running and you're getting feedback from all of them. And you're keeping on throwing models away, modifying models, incorporating new models while we work with a set of models. I think that's a very messy way of doing it, but it's a much more robust way and it provides kind of checks and balances. All right, folks, so let's see. What we're going to do now is we're going to go into small breakout rooms in order to continue this discussion on our approaches to personality. And then we will come back and do our one final round of takeaways, and we'll go from there. I'm